Hi, this is Steve Karski. I'm here with Steve Melton today, a risk manager, and we want to find out a little bit more about risk management. So Steve and I are talking about commercial general liability and medical payments. So Steve, I am renting a small office or key person office. Tell me, why do I need general liability? How does it help me, and what's important about that?
Well, hey, Steve, thanks for inviting me here today and appreciate the question. Steve, I want you to understand that you may be Steve Karski, sole proprietor, Enterprise Inc., and you're renting that key man office. And when you go in there and you see this 16-page lease that's presented to you by this landlord, it's going to be a little bit daunting. And most people just kind of scroll through it and look at what am I paying and what some of my obligations are going to be, et cetera, and they see that insurance portion and they just kind of gloss over it. But there is often some pretty strenuous clauses in there, and why you need to look at it is most of them want you to come up with evidence that you've got a general liability policy of $1 million, and they may want you to name them on your policy. And if somebody goes on the premises to visit you, if something happens, they want to be insulated from loss. You probably don't even know that. Have you thought about that, Steve?
Not for my business, no.
Not for your business. Well, most people don't, but it applies to you, Steve, just going in, if we're just using hypotheticals here, as a little space about the size of the office I'm in right now, maybe 50 to 100 square feet, all the way up to Coca-Cola. So they have the landlords put these caveats in there. So you need to have a policy in case something happens in that rental space or in potentially the common areas, not as much, that they're going to be insulated from loss. And you feel like it's almost a tax. Like what could ever happen? Well, probably nothing would ever happen. But if it does, they want to be protected. That's just something you need to look at. What the landlord worries about and it doesn't happen very often, but if there's a lawsuit or a complaint, what people do is they may get an attorney and they're going to name you and the landlord. And what a lot of people don't realize this, and I'll just give you an example in let's just say you're at least in a shopping center. We're talking about medical pay. Medical pay is usually part of a general liability policy. People don't pay a lot of attention to it. It's maybe $1,000 or $2,000 in coverage in there. It's called no fault. So essentially, if somebody's hurt on your property or the landlord's property, even, the insurance company's going to look at it, potentially issue a check up to a couple grand. They want to make everybody happy for the lawsuits to go away. But you may have 10 tenants in that retail shopping center. If somebody gets hurt on the common premises there, they could potentially go against that landlord for med pay for 10 slots.
Oh,
so,
wow.
I mean, there's a lot of liability that the landlords they want to try to insulate. So they don't want to have to go to their policy. They want to go to yours first. So this is all intricacies. You don't really think about it or what their reason is for it, but that's why they want you to go to you first, then potentially them second or never.
Okay. What about
that? Makes sense.
Yeah. How about just from the standpoint of the lease itself? What potential risks do I have because I have a lease with my landlord?
Let's just, if you have if you're just going at office cube, very, very little. So we'll kind of gravitate up. I mean, let's just give you an example of a client. Okay. He's moved into a large warehouse type space and he's setting up and he wants to build partitions. Well, he's investing money in, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in building partitions, right? So he brings in his contractor, who has to be technically an approved contractor by that landlord. I want to bring some person in that has no expertise or whatever. So the landlord might want proof on that. So the guy's putting in 40 grand worth of stuff and puts it in, and later on, a year or so later, he moves out. Well, the landlord basically says in the lease, that's my stuff. And then he's like, wait a minute here. That's my stuff. And he didn't even really think about it. Maybe during that lease time, if something would have happened to those walls, the tenant would have been responsible to cover that. But that's
Okay.
pretty much the landlord stuff. So those are the kind of things you got to think about as you're progressing through the lease. Anytime you're making improvements or betterments, we call them,
Hmm.
you're responsible for that. And the landlord technically usually says in the lease that they capture that unless there's an agreement otherwise.
Okay.
So those are also the kind of things you have to be aware of, and that subcontract you bring on the premises to do the work. If he is not a bonded or proper subcontract with the proper insurance, you could be potentially liable for that. So it only moves up the scale, Steve.
All right. Well, I've got a friend that sells some products online, and all he does is he kind of really assembles things. He doesn't really create products. Does he have any risk
Yeah.
for just the assembly piece of those products?
Well, you're moving into, we're getting away a little bit from that premise liability or lease type situation into the products. So if you're assembling or making building a product, you may be putting together a widget that you didn't design or had anything to do with. But general liability could be potentially cover once you sell that product or distribute it or whatever happens to it. If there's a complaint or suit, it could emanate back to you, and your insurance should cover that. And insurance companies want to know what you're doing,
Yeah.
how hazardous it is. I'll give you an example. I've got a client who assembles gas floor polishers. Well, they don't do the design or anything on it. They just assemble them, they distribute them, but they have a large product liability issue because it's gas, and they've got to get to worry about the vapors and all the rest of the stuff. And they have to put their UPC label on there as the manufacturer, even though they don't make the individual components. So that's important that you got to look at. People don't think about it.
So if I'm, let's say, just distributing somebody else's product, what exposures might I have for just distributing products for another, being a wholesaler, if you will?
Not as great, obviously. What the onus is more on whatever those products you're distributing that you aware that they do have an insurance policy. Depends on how many that you're working with, and that they're a valid company, et cetera. So you could actually ask to be insured under their policy. Not quite near as much liability, but if one of those products blows up or something happens in your facility, your landlord's going to try to go after you, and you're going to have to go after that person. So I call it the chain of fish, but not near as great an issue. If you're renting stuff or doing something like that and showing people how to operate the products and stuff, yeah, that gets into a greater issue. But or if you have people's stuff that's in your, like let's say a vehicle or their personal property, like a dry cleaner or something like that, in your care, custody, and control, you may have some liability for the retaining those if something happens to those goods in your control. So that all that stuff mushrooms as you get bigger and get more complex under general liability.
How about for somebody that, let's say, doesn't really sell products but does installation? Let's say they install, let's say, dishwashers for Lowe's, and what kind of exposure does that type of business have?
Well, if you're installing for Lowe's is going to vet you out, Steve, and make sure that you're listed on the Lowe's is going to be listed under your insurance policy, so to speak. So, that's Lowe's could potentially get involved. You install a dishwasher and the water channel tube breaks in the back or whatever, and Lowe's is how you bought the install, and Lowe's is going to have to take the responsibility to do it, but then they're going to come back to you and make sure you're going to get them back and cover that situation. So if it's just you on the line and not under the gauze of a Lowe's, it's you, a good homeowner or whatever. You got to watch who's you're going to bring in as a contractor, because you may never see them again. So.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes you need to make sure they're vetted contractors, and most homeowners don't do that. But yeah, it's good to work through an organization that you have confidence in.
Any other concerns that you have experienced from the standpoint of commercial general liability or any of the parts of liability that we talked about that you see pretty common that folks don't often think about?
A general liability policy is basically all inclusive except for blank, 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 blank. That's how they set these up, special risk policies. So if anybody's going to read one or look at one, they really need to see what's excluded or endorsed on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the bigger you get and the more complex vendors and such that you work with or do work for, you have to be aware that their needs are going to be a little bit more complex and that your general liability policy may not cover exactly what their needs are. It may not have the clauses in there. It may not meet the needs of a larger vendor situation or a contractor. So that's why it's good to have somebody like me to be able to look at those, your policy, to be able to interpret it. Because right where I go is I go to the main page. You may have $1 million, but let's look at what's excluded or added under your policy provision. That's where we go now.
Yeah. And
I
can imagine most businesses are not cookie cutter businesses. So whether it's a dry cleaner or a wholesaler or a pizza store, pizza place, none of them have the same risks, if you will, or the same exposure just because of the way they operate, I would suspect. Is that
for the most part? No, most retail places do. It just depends on, it comes down to if you're going to go into a garage situation, they're going to let you walk through the back with the mechanic without a mechanic around, that they're opening up themselves a little bit more. But everybody's a little different. And it's why it's important that they have a walkthrough with a risk manager or somebody that knows what they're doing to just kind of help them out, because nobody wants to use their insurance. I mean, it's there as a safety net.
Right. So part of a risk manager, it sounds like, is really to do a little walkthrough and help people identify potential hazards or risks they might have, as well as maybe policy and procedure. Does that make sense? I mean, is that?
Yes, it's important because we have to, for certain risks. I mean, if you're just a little retail store or something like that, I mean, there's not as much involved with it. If you're doing more of a beehive of activity, say you're a pool hall, something like that, I have to go in and answer all these supplementals and surveys, we call them, and get them to the insurance company, and they ask tons of questions. So it's really important for prospective clients to be truthful, answer them, and through the questioning process, a lot of them understand what their issues could be that they didn't even think about before.
Mm-hmm. Very good, Steve. Anything else to add that we haven't touched on?
No, not today. I think you've covered the major areas of your lease situation, your premise liability, potential products liability. That can get into a can of worms. So you got to look at that kind of stuff depending on what's involved. And we're not going to get in that auto liability situation today. That will be on another call. But I guess it just, call Steve Melton to give you a second opinion and help work through your questions and answers on what you may need.
Always good to have somebody that knows the risks and exposures you might have. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Steve.